I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined this evening, and I want to thank you all for taking the time. This should be a really fun virtual Corsair chat and very interesting evening. Of course, I want to thank Joe Augustyn, who's here, for taking the time to come and speak with all of you. I've known Joe for about 2.5 years, and I have to say, not only is he a wonderful human being with a great sense of humor and amazing stories about the CIA, which you'll hear tonight, but also very lucky for us, he is a huge supporter of UMass Dartmouth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the chat. I'm going to give a very brief introduction about Joe because one, you didn't come to hear me speak, and two, he's had such an illustrious career that there's no way to make it justice in one of these very brief introductions. So here we go. Joe attended UMass Dartmouth, where he received his bachelor's degree in history, and then he went on to Brown University and then doctoral studies in Russian history at Indiana University. Joe spent 28 years in the CIA. He's held many roles, including Chief of Staff for the Deputy Director for Operations, which included monitoring and managing the CIA's covert action programs. He was also the director of the CIA's Defector Resettlement Center, and he resettled high-level defectors to the US. This means he's had the opportunity to get to know many of the CIA's top spies. After 9/11, he was appointed the Deputy Associate Director of Central Intelligence for Homeland Security. In that role, he reported directly to the director of the CIA and was a frequent participant in White House, Pentagon, State Department, and law enforcement agency meetings. Finally, before his retirement in 2004, he became a senior advisor to John Brennan, who later became the CIA director. Together, they are both considered key architects of what is now the National Counterterrorism Center. That's pretty impressive, I would say. Now, before I turn it over to Joe, I do have a couple of housekeeping items for all of you. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions. We've reserved about 20 minutes at the end of the chat so that we can get to as many questions from you as we can. Also, due to Joe's extensive time at the CIA, he's not going to have the opportunity to go over everything this evening. So we're going to have a couple of slides in the background that goes over his career, some of which I've already highlighted. We'll leave those up for a few minutes each, and then we will take them down so that you can just interact with Joe. So I think that's everything. And Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carol, for that introduction. And thank you, participants, for spending some of your Wednesday evening with me and learning a little bit, hopefully, about the CIA. I'm going to start with a story that's not CIA related, but I think you'll find it relevant. So my wife and I have two kids. My wife, by the way, Michelle, is a graduate of UMass Dartmouth, an English major, and wound up teaching as part of her career. And we have a son and a daughter, both of whom are grown now, both of whom have 2 kids. So we have a total of 4 grandchildren, and that's the best club in the world, by the way, is the grandparent club. But this story goes back several decades with my daughter. We were living in Michigan at the time, and Catherine, my daughter, was in the 2nd grade, as I recall. And for some reason, I was home. And she came home that day and all excited. And she said, "Dad, you know, we had a guest speaker today." And I said, "Oh, that's really cool, you know?" And she said, "Yeah, he spent a lot of time talking to us." And I said, "Well, what did he do?" And she said, "Well, he was a Major League Baseball umpire." I said, me, as a baseball fan, I thought that was terrific. And I said, well, that's really awesome. I said, what was his name? And she said, I don't remember his name, but I think it was Al, A-L, because he had A-L on the top of his baseball hat, which we all know was American League and not his name, Al. And then I said to her, you know, what did he talk about? What did he talk about for so long with you? And I think that question floored her a little bit. She looked at me sitting on my lap. She looked at me with her big brown eyes and said, what did he talk about, Dad? He didn't say. Okay. So, I say that because I want to talk to you and I want to leave something with you. And so you don't walk away saying he really didn't say anything. So I decided, as Carol said, in CIA, we have a lot of jobs. And you can see on the screen some of the jobs I had. And I was trying to figure out, where I could specifically share some things with you that maybe the general public doesn't know without spending a comprehensive amount of time talking about the defector program, which I really loved, or what I did after 9/11, where we helped formulate the first Homeland Security policy before the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security. Those kind of things take hours, right? I mean, we could teach a course on, Introduction to Intelligence 101, and we have 35 minutes to do it. So what I decided to do was just take a small segment of what you might be interested in, and maybe give you some insights into what a case officer does in CIA. And you probably know more than 98% of the population about what a case officer does. To be honest, I told Carol earlier, I didn't know what CIA did when I joined. Okay, so it's a confusing place. The CIA, when you think about the CIA, you think about your TV shows and your movie shows, and it's always talking about the clandestine service and operations and car chases and all of that kind of thing. Well, that's part of and some of that does in fact happen, but that's part of the Directorate of Operations. CIA as an entity, and I can tell you that, and you might be interested in hearing that the actual number of people who work in the CIA is classified, but I can tell you that it's in the mid 20,000 range. So that it's a relatively small organization. I mean, when you compare it to the Department of Defense or Department of Justice or even the FBI, that has about 35 or 36,000 people. So we're relatively small. And in that small group, there's an even smaller group called the Directorate of Operations, where I spent 26 out of my 28 years undercover as a clandestine service officer. The rest of the CIA, we have there are directorates. So picture the big program, and then segments or units within CIA. So there's a Directorate of Analysis. And you know what that means. We have a bunch of PhDs, we have a bunch of area specialists who, provide the kind of analytical support that the National Security Council and the White House needs to make foreign policy decisions. There's a Directorate of Science and Technology. And as you might guess, they're the scientists, they're the physicists, they're the engineers, they're the people who actually help us, design kind of operational tools, if you will. We have a Directorate of Analysis. And by the way, all of these people are not undercover usually. These are all CIA acknowledged employees. And we have a Directorate of Analysis, a Director of Administration that does logistical stuff for us. Anything an admin directorate you might think does. They pay us, they take care of our leave, they take care of our insurance, they do logistical stuff. And then we have a Directorate of Digital Innovation, which is a relatively new directorate, that deals with cyber issues and all the things that make up the modern world. So directorate of analysis, director of S&T, a directorate of an administration, and a directorate of digital innovation. And then there's the clandestine service, the DO, for which most people focus on what the DO does and focus on all the activities that you see on TV and in the movies and that kind of thing. So what I thought I would do in the time remaining is really to give you an insight in terms of what a case officer does. Now, CIA has case officers, right? We're not CIA agents. If you ever see a movie that calls somebody a CIA agent or a TV show that talks about CIA agents, turn off the set, because that's not really what we call ourselves, and that's bad parlance in terms of who we are. Our agents are the ones that we recruit overseas. So if we recruit a Russian overseas, that's our Russian agent, okay? So keep in mind the kind of the terminology that we have. So what I thought we'd do in the time that I have is to give you a feel for what a case officer does, right? So you're hired as a case officer, and the first thing you do when you're hired as a case officer, and it's a very extensive and long process. It took me way back when, I think 10 months before we went through everything, which include background checks and polygraphs and all of that kind of thing. But so you're hired. Okay, you go to Washington, you swear an oath, the same oath that the vice president swears, and then you're sent to the farm, which is our training facility. It's known as the farm. Nobody's supposed to tell you where it is, but everybody knows where it is. And you spend about 9 months to 10 months learning what it takes to be a case officer overseas. You're assigned a cover. That's the cover you use probably for most of your career, if not all of your career. I was a State Department officer for 26 of my 28 years working in the agency. I had the best cover in the world, by the way. I was an admin officer. So, I went on a plane, I talked to somebody, and somebody says, "What do you do?" And I say, "I work for the State Department." And they say, "Oh, that's very interesting. Are you a Foreign Service officer, a diplomat?" And I go, "No, I work in admin." And that shuts off the conversation immediately. So I had the best cover in the world. And so what happens? So you're assigned a cover. And by the way, I worked in alias for, many years when doing operational activity. And it becomes second nature after a while. But so you're hired as a CIA case officer, and you're sent for training for about 9 or 10 months. And in training at the farm, as we call it, you do things like we did surveillance detection training, which is incredibly important as part of your trade craft. Surveillance detection, you do small arms training, so you know how to handle a gun. We do crash and bang, which is fun, which is, how to get out of a roadblock and drive these old cars. And it's the kind of cool stuff that everybody would like to do, right? And you also learn elicitation techniques. In other words, how are you going to get somebody to trust you, and how are you going to get somebody to actually wind up spying against their own country? So that's a 9 or 10 month process. Then what happens? Okay, then headquartered. And by the way, you have to get certified as a case officer. This is not boot camp like you would think about if you were a Marine or an Army Special Forces individual. This is, it's a little more it's a little more civil, but you still have to pass, and you still have to be certified as a case officer. And we've actually failed people as a case officer, or they not certified, and we send them back to headquarters and we find another appropriate position for them. Okay, so now you're a certified case officer. So what do? The agency then has needs and will send you, and you have a somewhat of a preference, but not a lot. They'll send you to a station overseas, a CIA station. Now, most of you know, and you probably heard and read, Every major country in the world has an embassy, right? And within that embassy, in most places around the world, there's a small component, probably stuck away in some higher floor, that's called the CIA station. It's run by what we call a chief of station or a COS within the embassy running the CIA station. And case officers are assigned, and we have stations all over the world, not just in Paris, not just in Beijing, not just in Moscow, but even some countries where you wouldn't suspect we would have a CIA station. Let's say Africa, as an example. And why do we have a station in Africa? We're not recruiting Africans. We don't care if we have a station in Paris, which we do. We're not recruiting the French. We're recruiting people. We have stations in those countries because the targets are there. So who are our targets? The targets are the ones you might suspect. Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, Iranians, any of our adversaries, right? They're the ones that are also in the cities where they have representation in their own embassy. And so that's why we're sent there. So what does a case officer do? The job of a case officer is to recruit foreign assets to spy against their country and turn against their country and actually become traitors. It sounds tough. It sounds, and frankly, it's not for everybody to be able to do that kind of thing. Okay. But I can tell you this, and being in the business, at the agency for 28 years and even longer in the business, doing things after I retired, it's a tough world out there. And it's spy versus spy. I live in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm talking to you from Fairfax, Virginia. And I can tell you in DC, without exaggeration, there are hundreds of spies. Hundreds of spies. There are dozens and dozens of spies in Boston. There might even be some in North Dartmouth, for all I know. But the point is, it's the kind of world where we have to be better than our bad guys. So case officer then goes assigned to a station, and he's going to look for targets. And we have a mantra in the DO, which you may have heard about, anyone who knows anything about the business, or have you read. We have a mantra that you spot somebody, you assess somebody, you develop somebody, and then you recruit somebody. Now, case officer goes, let's say, to Paris, and how does he spot a target? Well, Langley, our headquarters in Virginia, have a group of people called targeting officers. Targeting officers know who's in a particular locale, what their position is, and whether or not those targeting officers believe that that person has the kind of intelligence that's necessary for national security issues. And we call that kind of intelligence human. It's HUM for human and INT. There are a lot of ints in the intelligence business, right? There's human, which means it's human intelligence. You get it directly from somebody. There's SIGINT, satellite, signals intelligence. There's a thing called MASINT, materials and signature intelligence. There's OSINT, open source intelligence. All that kind of intelligence comes together in Washington at Langley or at CIA headquarters. So why is human so important? Okay. I mean, if you can bug somebody's computer, or if you can listen to somebody's phone, or you can find things in open source, why is human so important? And the reason human or human intelligence is so important is because that's the only intelligence that describes intent. Intent. You talk to somebody, you recruit somebody, and you can find out what they're doing, what their plans are, what they intend to do 6 months from now, a year from now, or even the next day. So human has been around since biblical times, right? I mean, and the intelligence and spying is often known as the second oldest profession in the world, right? And so it's been around forever, and it's not going away. And that's what clandestine service officers do. Okay, so we're back to, we need to spot somebody. Okay, and so our headquarters in Langley, targeting officers say, hey, we got this person in Paris that needs to be, that we think may have access to the kind of intelligence we need. So that's the spotting part. Then it's assessing. Then it's up to the case officer. It's up to the case officer to find a way to meet that target. Okay, it might be at a conference that this target might go to. It might be at a bar that the target goes to frequently. It might be at a soccer match that this person goes, and it's your job. And this is where, the training comes in, and how to meet people, how to assess people, and we how to bump into this person. And then you create, I'm giving you the kind of textbook version, and trust me, there are a million variations on this, literally. But, the idea is to get close to this person, right? To assess this person, to become friends with this person. And then, and usually you get guidance from your station and some of the senior officers on how best to do this. And then you assess the person in terms of whether or not you think they have vulnerabilities, or you think they have a niche by which you can eventually look to the recruitment process. In my career, in dealing with defectors and being deputy chief in East Asia Division and working in the Near East Division for a while, I've met dozens and dozens of spies, people who have turned against their country. And I can tell you this, without really much doubt, that nobody spies against their country unless they really want to. Okay, they don't do it unless they really want to. And that's what case officers are trying to determine. Is this person the kind of person who wants to provide information? And why do people spy? I'll tell you, and very frankly, and Carol knows I'm pretty frank about a lot of things. They spy because of one of four reasons. They spy because going back to the KGB training, the KGB, the old Russian, now it's the SVR, but it used to be known as the KGB. They came up with an acronym, which is MICE, M-I-C-E, MICE. Okay, and the KGB used to say somebody will turn against their country for one of those letters, M-I-C-E. First one, M, obvious, money. People will turn because of money. And we pay our assets, by the way, or our agents if they're recruited. I for ICE, in MICE, I, ideology, okay? They hate their system. They hate the communist system. They hate whatever system they're in, and they turn because of that. The KGB used to say C, and the third letter in MICE was coercion. And I can tell you, again, without a doubt, absolutely, CIA does not coerce people to spy. There are rules against it. It's legal. It's illegal to do that. We don't blackmail people. The KGB used to and still does. And the final one is E in MICE, the letter E, ego. Huge factor in the recruitment process. And when I look back on it and talking with dozens and dozens of spies and knowing dozens of spies, ego is huge in this formula. Money, and add a little money into it, and there's your vulnerability. There's the reason why a lot of people turn against their country, right? And when I say ego, it's usually, and I can tell you, I've had some of the CIA's top spies always think they're smarter than I am, for sure. They're usually A personalities. They think they're smarter than you. They're risk takers, and you add a little money into that, and they're susceptible to recruitment. So a CIA case officer, it's his job or her job, and we do have it's about 50-50 now in terms of case officer, male versus female. And it's a matter of finding the right pocket to eventually make the pitch for them to give us information that we wouldn't normally have. Okay. And, it's not for everybody. I mean, this job is not for everybody because, you befriend people. Maybe you start playing tennis with this person and they don't know yet you're CIA. They think you're a State Department officer. So maybe you play a lot of tennis, or maybe you go to soccer games, or maybe you meet the family. Maybe you go to dinners. And in the back of your head, you're saying, why am I doing this? And you're really doing it because you want to do it for the security of your country. Okay. And at some point, you make the pitch. And if you're good, it's an easy pitch because they know eventually who you are and what you're doing. Not initially, but eventually. And so you make the pitch, and that's a recruitment. And then what happens? As long as that person has access to information, you're going to run that person, as we call it. So a case officer finds that person. And by the way, what's a successful case officer tour? But, we send a case officer, I'm using Paris as an example, just hypothetically. That person's tour would be generally 3 years. Okay. And, what's a successful case officer, success story in Paris, might be 2 recruitments. It depends on where you are. If you get 1 recruitment in Beijing, it's a big deal because it's hard to work Beijing. If you get 1 recruitment in Moscow, it's a huge deal because it's hard to work in Moscow. If you're in Nairobi, yeah, maybe 2. And it could be Chinese, it could be Russian, it could be Iranian. And so, but it's not for everybody because, you really are asking someone to betray their country. My point to you is that nobody does this unless they really want to. And so that's how it works, right? And then after that, you're assigned another place, perhaps, and you continue. And when I did it, I used a number of aliases, which is always a scary thing, by the way. I had an alias passport, I had alias credit cards, I had alias driver's license. And, the first couple of times you did that, I'll tell you what, the adrenaline push is really, really pretty amazing. And getting back to what a case officer does, in all of this, the most important thing is the safety of your agent, the recruited agent, right? You don't want them, and that's why tradecraft comes into play. Surveillance detection routes. We run surveillance detection routes before we were going to meet somebody. Why do we do that? Because we want to make sure, obviously, that the person is not being followed or you're not being followed, and then then you can meet. And the safety of our agent is the most important thing we have. And the targets we do go after, it's not everybody. As I said, it's not the bus driver. Well, could be, I suppose, but it's not the normal person, right? It's the military officers overseas. It's the scientists overseas. It's the other intelligence officers overseas, your enemy or your adversary you're trying to recruit. It could be an academician overseas. And the idea of, and then we have a grading system, by the way. If you remember your college days and high school days, we do have a grading system in terms of the kind of intelligence we produce. It's not because you write it poorly, or it's not because it's composed in a funny way, but rather it's the value of the intelligence. If I recruit somebody and I'm talking to this person, and by the way, if I'm talking to a nuclear scientist, I'm relying on headquarters Langley to provide the kind of questions I should ask. Because guess what? I know nothing about nuclear engineering. But so Langley would give us a bunch of questions and they'd say, this, can you answer this? We write it up, we send it in. If it's okay, we get an S, satisfactory. And it's not, again, it's not because of what you're doing, it's the value of the intelligence. You strive for G, which is a good report. We do have E for excellent reports. And then we actually have a grade called O for outstanding that literally changes the nature of our foreign policy. I've had 2 O reports in my entire 28-year career, which means that the intelligence was so good that they briefed it to the White House the next day, and the White House had to change or take a different route in terms of what their plan was on a particular security issue. So that's the process, right? That's what it feels like. That's what you do, right? And again, it takes a certain kind of person to do it. But I wanted you to understand that, so next time you go to an embassy, look up and you'll probably, you'll know there's a CIA station there. And this is intelligence 101 for the audience and you folks who logged in just to get a feel for what this is about. If we had more time, we ever do this again, we'll do defectors and we can spend an hour doing that. We can do homeland security. We can do counterterrorism. But this is CIA 101. And I see another slide up there, which means I'm running out of time. So
not running out of time, but
no, not running out of time, but changing focus a little
yes.
bit. Okay.
And I want to thank you first. I always thought that CIA agents were agents. So I already learned something with just that simple fact. And I think it's fascinating to, Joe and I had talked about this earlier, but just fascinating to understand how the movies portray things or the books, and then what is the actual reality of things. And I think that was a good primer for us to understand all of that.
Well, thank you for saying that. By the way, I've never been in a car chase. I have been surveilled. I've had scary moments, but never a car chase. I didn't flip cars. So just so you know, in 28 years.
Wow.
So, go ahead.
Yep. Good to know for sure, because in the movies there's a lot of cars flipping for sure. I did want to change the subjects just for a few minutes before we go to the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage you all listening to please put any questions you have in the box. We'll spend about 20 minutes answering your questions. We're very lucky to have Joe at UMass Dartmouth. He's one of our strongest supporters. And as he pointed out, his wife, Michelle, is also an alum of UMass Dartmouth and involved here as well. But Joe is on our foundation board. He and his wife have founded a scholarship here and support some of our students. He was also the recipient of the 2019 Alumni Achievement Award. And the fun picture on the screen is him and his family at the award ceremony. He's one of our frequent speakers on campus, and he participates in many of our campus events. So we're really grateful for Joe and all the support he gives to UMass Dartmouth. And one quick question I have is, why do you choose to support your alma mater in this way, and why do you care about UMass Dartmouth, which you came to school here, but what is the appeal for you?
Yeah, I'll tell you. I don't think we talked really about my background. I mean, I grew up in New Bedford, as did my wife in the South End and me in the North End, I was probably like some of you on this webinar, if we call it that. I was I lived in a tenement. My mother and father never went to college. My mother never graduated from high school, as bright as she was, because she was a victim of the Depression and had to support her family. And I was the first one, like probably many of you, to attend college. And it wasn't called UMass Dartmouth back then, but I'm going to call it UMass Dartmouth for simplicity's sake. But UMass Dartmouth provided me that entree. I was a okay high school student, but I was probably your average high school student who really didn't think too much about my future. By the way, I did read Ian Fleming books on James Bond, which I thought was cool. But I didn't know what I wanted to do, and UMass Dartmouth was there for me. It was a school that I can afford. And let me tell you this little story that may sound a little schmaltzy. Is that a word? I don't know if I can use that to you. But the first time I was asked to go to the White House and brief the president in the Oval Office, I arrived early. Of course, I'm not going to be late, right? And I remember sitting in the ante room waiting to be called into the Oval Office. And I'm thinking to myself, I felt pretty cool about that. I'm thinking, here I am, a guy that grew up in a tenement in New Bedford. And here I am at the White House, just about ready to brief the president. Okay. And then I thought, where did this all start? I told you I was an average student in high school. I went to UMass and I had great faculty members, and not just history professors, but I took a course in international law. I took Russian for the first time. I did a lot of English literature. And I look back and I said, that's where I started to turn the corner. And I started to realize that, maybe I was smarter than I really acted or thought I was. And then I had faculty members who were really terrific. And then I had faculty who actually took interest in me and encouraged me and became my mentors. And I look back on that, and to be honest, I'll be eternally grateful for that, because it made me turn the corner. It made me see things in the world that I've never seen before. I mean, yeah, I went to Brown University. I have a master's in Brown. I went to Indiana. I spent 3 years in a PhD program. But guess what? Nothing compares to what that turning point for me was at UMass. And you don't really think about that until later in your life, right? Because everything's go, 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 try to do this. And then I began to think, what was the turning point? Who was it? What professors? What did I really learn that encouraged me to do other things that I never thought I would? And so literally I was thinking about that in the anteroom of, in the White House before I went. And I said, I owe it all to UMass Dartmouth. Okay. And, I do a lot of things. I do a lot of mentoring here in the DC area. I try to do as much as I can from Virginia with UMass Dartmouth. I'm on the foundation board, and it's a real honor to do that. And it's a real sense of satisfaction to express my gratitude to UMass Dartmouth by giving what I can back to the university. So I encourage everybody out there. You may be too young. I'm an old guy, right? And I can reflect, but start reflecting now, because what you've learned at UMass Dartmouth, where you are now, is it has a lot to do with UMass Dartmouth. So keep them in your thoughts. I know, send money, do all the right thing, because it's what gave me my start, and I'm sure it's the same with many of you out there.
Thank you for that. I always think I've had other similar conversation with other alumni, and I think to myself that UMass Dartmouth for a lot of people is the foundation, is how I put it. The start, the laying the ground, and then from there, as you said, Brown and other places, and the CIA, President's office. But I think for a lot of our students and alumni, eventually, it is a place to get to see that there's a lot of world out there and there's a lot they can do. So And we certainly appreciate everything, again, you do for UMass Dartmouth. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna turn it to the questions now, and I'm gonna get started on those. And so the first one, how has the CIA changed since the start of your career?
That's a good question, actually. And like the rest of society, the CIA has changed a great deal. Um, when I first started in the CIA, and I entered on duty in 1976, if you can believe that, right? And when I got there, it was still kind of known as and I talk a lot with my hands, by the way, and I'm not Italian, by the way. So, but it was still back then known as a kind of an old boys club. The original clandestine service officer cadre was made up a lot of kind of well-off, well-heeled Ivy Leaguers, right? We recruited mostly from the Ivy League at that point, and it's no longer the case. I mean, it's evolved to the point where if you have the right traits, if you have the right personality, if you have the right kind of education, your chances of getting in the CIA are as good as anyone else's. And I can tell you, like the rest of society has changed, we were not terribly politically correct back then.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I had old legendary case officers who would not last more than a day in the current CIA. And having said that, and I think I mentioned it to you in part of my remarks, we hire many more women as case officers in the CIA. And I think the last time I checked, we're about 50-50, and if not 51% hiring female case officers, which we didn't do so often. Okay. Is it easy to be a women case officer? They do as well as the men. That said, you have to think about the world, right? I mean, it's hard to send a female case officer to Saudi Arabia,
Mm-hmm.
for example. I mean, the Saudis have come a long way. Women drive now in Saudi Arabia only since a couple of years ago. So there are a little bit of restrictions that are not our doing, but rather the way the world is currently. But I think we've changed. I think we're much more inclusive. I'll give you another example. When I joined in 1976, I never smoked marijuana, even though I was a graduate student with long hair and a Fu Manchu mustache and a big sideburns. I never smoked marijuana. In 1976, I would not have gotten in the agency if I had smoked. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now we've evolved to the point where, we understand, college students smoke weed and it's legal in many places, right? They even experiment with hard drugs, and we're okay with that. We're okay with that in the sense, as long as you're not doing it now or right before your interview, if you've experimented, that's okay. So we've evolved with the times. I think we're smarter. When I joined, and we didn't have Facebook or Instagram back then, but when that came about, the first thing was, no, you don't want to be on Facebook. You don't want to have your picture out there. You don't want to be on Instagram. Now we require it. You know why? Because if you're not, people say, well, why aren't you on Facebook? Or what? I guess Facebook is no longer in vogue, but why aren't you on TikTok? Or why aren't you on that? So we've changed with the times, and I think we've done well. I think we're inclusive now. And, I think, we've hired a much more diverse workforce than it looked back in 1970s. And I think we're still evolving and getting better.
Great. Before the next Corsair chat, we'll definitely want one of those pictures of you in the 70s to share. How do you think that the US intelligence landscape is shifting since the country's focus on near-peer adversaries, as opposed to terrorism?
One more time, repeat that question.
Yes, I know it's a tough one. I think, how do you think the US intelligence landscape is shifting since the country's focus has shifted on near-peer adversaries as opposed to terrorism?
Adversaries as opposed to terrorism?
Yeah, near-peer adversaries as opposed to terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, now there are 18 agencies within the intelligence community, right? And terrorism has gone away as we know it. But I want to talk about that for a second. And we've had to shift our focus on different things. A few years ago, I would have said that Russia was our main target. We look now, and it's China. No question about it. China is our main target. And we've after 9/11, I remember like it was yesterday, and I played I played an interesting role after 9/11 in helping to form the National Counterterrorism Center. We haven't. What the public needs to know is we haven't lost our focus on certain issues like terrorism. Terrorism, by the way, and it's never going away. Terrorism has been around since time immemorial, right? And it never goes away because of three main reasons. It's cheap, it's easy, and it's effective. Okay, just think about 9/11 for a second, and I'm diverting a little bit from the question, but just think about 9/11 for a second. We had countries like China and Russia and North Korea and Iran could never bring us to our knees in the Cold War, right? Never brought us to our knees. On 9/11, 2001, 19 terrorists brought the U.S. to its knees. Not Russia, not China, not any major force, 19 terrorists. They brought us to our knees. It changed the way we live, right? We have spent billions of dollars creating TSA and Homeland Security and all this counterterrorism stuff. So I say that because we can't, I used to read a passage from the Scottish Declaration of Independence, and I used to read it to classes that I lecture at, and I say, and there's phrases in there about we have to fight terrorism because it's not going away and it's affecting the way we live. And I say, when was that written? And they go, I don't know, last month. And I say, no, it was written in 1215, or whenever the Scottish Declaration of Independence was written. So, while we change our focus to look more on China and the economics of things, and we've actually done a study on COVID at the agency and the origins of COVID. That's somewhat controversial, but we've changed with the subjects that come about daily. But at the same time, you ought to know, and I'd like the American public to know that we haven't forgotten about what really hurt us and what will continue to be an issue for years to come. So I think that's important. Okay, another question.
Thank you. So I think you've got a interested party here. So is there a maximum age range for case officer applications? And how would you recommend for someone applying to stand out amongst a field of applicant? Is the CIA currently actively hiring case officers? Yes. And added to that is, thank you for your service. Fantastic chat.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That's very nice. The answer is the CIA is always hiring good people. And, I talk to a lot of kids. I call them kids. Can I call them kids? I talk to a lot of students around DC, and they say they go on the website and it said there are no jobs. That's BS. The CIA is always looking for good people. Okay. And the maximum age, by the way, you know, it's not set in stone, but the usually you would like to have a case officer come in before the age of 35. Okay. So if you think about it, you want somebody to have a career, right? So that's 30 years. And so, the age is 35, although, it's somewhat flexible, in the sense if there was an applicant that had all the right tickets and all the right languages and all the right expertise, if they're 36 or 37, we're taking them. Okay. It's not easy to get in the CIA, but I always tell people don't be afraid to apply. Okay. Last year, I'm told we had over 100,000 applications.
Wow.
And we took 2,000 people. That's 2%. Okay. Now, so what makes an applicant stand out? I'll tell you, and this goes back to the UMass Dartmouth thing. If you want to be in the clandestine service, and I talked about an analytical side, I talked about the S&T side, I talked about the admin side. That's a whole different ballgame. I'm talking about in the clandestine service, right? In the DO, Directorate of Operations. I'd rather take a guy from New Bedford or Fall River or somebody who knows how to, knows, all aspects of life, as opposed to some, and it's not to say we don't take people from Harvard or the Ivy League, but, I think people like the way I grew up have this equally, if not a better chance of getting in the agency than others. So and what makes a person stand out? I talk to a bunch of high school kids every year at the University of Maryland. They have a conference and they bring kids in from all over the country for a week. And I tell them this, what makes your application or your resume stand out? Everybody's resume is, I have a GPA of 3.6 and I'm active in all these things, and they all sound the same, right? Everybody's good, right? So what makes your application stand out? One of the things is a couple things, good travel. I went to Bahamas, that doesn't count, right? But I mean, what stands out really, a discriminator on one's resume is a hard language. And when I say a hard language, I mean Russian, Chinese, Urdu, Pashto, Arabic, whatever, right? But a hard language. Because I had Russian when I applied back in the late 70s. I don't have, I've lost most of it, but and I've never been to Russia, by the way. There's the irony. I've worked in 45 countries. Wow. Doing operational stuff, but I've never been to Russia, and I can't go now because they know me and they won't let me in. But because I'll never come back. But but taking a hard language is a real discriminator. I tell people who ask, I say, look, even if you go to the local high school and take Arabic, once a week, and you put that on your resume, that's a real discriminator, right? Or Russian or Chinese. So, you have to, how you stand out that's one of the ways. Another thing is the kind of travel you've done. And the other thing is, good grades and having an understanding of what's going on in the world, because you will be interviewed. I used to volunteer to do. They used to bring senior people in to interview our younger incoming class of case officers, and I would spend 4 hours with them. And what everybody looks for is what's your motivation, and how do you fit in as a group? I mean, because it's a team effort. Even though I told you the case officers do things on their own, solo, you want to be a team player. So, I don't know if this answers the person's question, but the basic 35, right? And
yeah.
Okay.
So we have about 5 minutes left. This is somewhat of a related question, but how did you end up in the CIA? What was your path to the CIA?
Yeah, well, as you know, I got interested in Russian history when I was at UMass Dartmouth, and I studied Russian history at Brown and got a master's there. And then after that, by the way, I can't, believe it or not, I was hired back at UMass Dartmouth to teach classes. I was an instructor. I was so cheap that they could not hire me. Okay. And so I was 23 years old and I was teaching evening classes in Western Civ and American economic history and 17th and 18th century European thought, stuff that I didn't know anything about, frankly, but I was teaching because I was cheap and they needed help. So my affiliation goes way back then. But so anyway, so then I thought maybe, I was so interested in Russian studies. Indiana had one of the best programs in the country at the time, and frankly, still does. I went to Indiana, and I was married at the time, and still am. And I spent 3 years doing that, and I thought I wanted to be a college professor. Okay, and so when you say I did doctoral studies, I spent 3 years, but I never finished a dissertation, which I had started, and nobody in the world was interested in that subject except me. And then I started losing interest in it, and I got recruited by the CIA then. So here's how it worked. My thesis advisor at Indiana was turned out to be one of my mentors for life. Recently, not too long ago, passed away, but he was my mentor for life. Was a member of the original CIA Board of National Estimates. So he knew the CIA, and he called me in one day and he said, "Joe, you ever think about the CIA?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't know what it is and what they do." And so my path was, like you might see in the movies. He said to me, "I got a guy coming into Indianapolis. You ought to talk to him." Okay, so I drove from Bloomington up to Indianapolis. I bought a blazer for the first time, I think, in ages. And, I looked freaky, but he invited me to Washington. I went to Washington. I came back and I told Michelle, "We're moving to Washington." And so my recruitment was by referral. It doesn't always happen that way. This was obviously before online applications and everything, but that was my path to the CIA. And I realized I really didn't want to be a professor, and it was, I never looked back.
Great. I think we're going to do one last one. It's 7:27. So let's see if you can answer it. Well, I know you can answer it, but quickly. But how long does it take to assess someone and to get close to someone in your work when you're doing that? I'm sure there's a range, but
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, and I wish I could give you a good answer. I mean, there are some people, believe it or not, in this world there are some adversary, targets out there that want to. They're looking for this, right? And so it could be an easy assessment, right? But oftentimes it can take, and again, depending on the target and how important it is, it could take anywhere from a couple of months to a year, right? At some point, we always used to say, okay, either, either do it or get off the pot, right? I mean, at some point you have to make that decision. But again, it's based on the personality, depends on the relationship. It depends on, how quickly each of you meld. You have to be a chameleon of some sort to some degree, but it's a matter of anywhere from a month to a year. But we don't let it go on too long, because if you can't figure it out in a year, then you're not doing your job.
Got it. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone who joined us this evening, and I especially want to thank Joe. That was really informative and a fun Corsair chat. I had a lot of fun. I hope all of you did as well. If we did not get to your question, you can email alumni@umassd.edu, or if you think of a question tomorrow or later tonight, please feel free to email. Joe has graciously offered to get those questions and try to answer them as best as he can if we didn't get to you. But again, thank you all for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a good night. And thank you for supporting UMass Dartmouth.
Thanks, everybody. Everybody have a good night. Thank you.